composition fallacy and division fallacy. Now, they're two separate fallacies, folks, but one of them is like the mirror opposite of the other one. Composition fallacy occurs when we too quickly assume that the whole thing, whatever that whole thing happens to be, will have the same characteristics as its individual parts. Composition fallacy occurs when we too quickly assume that the whole thing, whatever the whole thing happens to be, will have the same characteristics as its individual parts. Now, folks, sometimes an entire thing does have the same characteristics as its individual parts too. The problem is, this has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. You can't just assume that the whole thing will merely be a sum total of its parts, nor vice versa. Division fallacy occurs when we too quickly assume that the individual parts will have the same characteristics as the whole thing. And if I can give you another diagram, since I find diagrams sometimes to be helpful shorthand, with composition fallacy, we too quickly make assumptions about the parts and then we generalize to the whole. And in division, we too quickly make generalizations about the whole thing and then we generalize about the individual parts. Now, I'll give you an academic example of composition fallacy first, and then I'll give you some more general ones. For those of you who have taken Intro to Philosophy or are thinking about taking Intro to Philosophy, one fabulous member of the Philosopher's Dream Team is an 18th century Scottish philosopher named David Hume. He famously argues against the idea that all you have to do is look at our little corner of the world and you can quickly infer what about the universe. It must be all intelligently designed because we see that it has the signs of complexity. Well, David Hume says, well, look, we are looking at some of the parts of the universe. Human beings, frogs' legs, trees, and things of this nature. These things do appear orderly to us. But he asked this question, how much of the expanse of the universe have we actually observed? At his time, basically a pinpoint of the universe. Now we've seen a little bit more thanks to technology. But in the grand scheme of things, we have seen very little of the expanse of the universe. Hume doesn't use this word in his writing, but he implies it. Those who too quickly assume that the entire universe must be ordered on the basis of our observation of a small amount of the parts are committing composition fallacy. Just because some of the parts might exhibit this characteristic doesn't mean that we can necessarily generalize it to the whole. Now I'll give you some more boring examples. Here's one from the textbook. So this might help you out on the practice problems. This is relatively late in the list, so I'm obviously not assigning it for homework. The person says, when I go to Atlantic mixity, I only play the quarter slots. That way I don't lose too much. Now the reason why that's an example of composition fallacy is the person is assuming that she will only be losing in small increments. Therefore, the total amount that I will lose will have to be a small amount. By the way, wise people know that small increments can what? Add up. And they can seriously add up. One more boring example. If you watch a lot of sports, what are the main kinds of commercials you see, other than beer commercials? Come on. Car commercials. Watch enough sports. There's at least one car commercial in every single commercial break. And I think I'm safe in making that generalization. Almost all of them will talk about the low monthly payments. And of course, they're getting your psychology working. You see a low monthly payment and you think low cost. But of course, multiply that by 60 or more months, and suddenly your low payments end up being a huge chunk of change over time. They're trying to beg you to commit something like composition fallacy. Small individual parts, therefore the totality must be small too. I'll give you one more boring example. The parts of common table salt, sodium and chloride, are deadly what in their unalloyed state? They're deadly poisonous in their unalloyed state. But when you put them together as a compound, they're perfectly safe unless you have too darn much of it. The parts don't always add up to the whole. And the other side is, the sum total of the whole doesn't necessarily show itself in each of the individual parts. I'll give you a boring example. You'll notice, this is a sports kind of example, some of the very best teams in sports don't always have the best what? The best individual players. They don't always have the very best individual players because the best individual players don't always make good team players. So the sum total of the whole does not necessarily add up to the parts either. Just because the whole thing might be great, it doesn't mean that each of the individual parts will have that same set of characteristics either. Now, folks, don't mess these up because frequently students will see an argument and they will say, oh, that's composition fallacy. And they say, well, no, you mixed it up. It's division fallacy. Just remember, composition is when we reason from parts to whole erroneously, and division fallacy is when we reason the characteristics of the whole to the individual parts. So when you suspect composition or division fallacy, make sure you know which direction the person is arguing in. That way you won't foul it up.